One of the biggest challenges when you're trying to come up with a great illustration is to come up with a great color scheme to go along with it. It's important that the colors that you choose really sort of influence and direct the mood of the illustration you're trying to create, but there are also often things that need to be a particular color, and I think balancing this can be a massive challenge. Now, at the Drawing Codex, I'm a huge fan of simple frameworks, simple processes, simple color plans, and I think this stuff really is at the core of just getting down to business and creating an image that works. But it's one thing to look at the theory, it's another thing to apply it. So in this video, which is actually part one of a multi-part tutorial series, what I'm going to do is share with you how I create a high quality, cover quality, sort of finished illustration in the line and color style. This is going to be part one, and we're going to look at color thumbnails. The color thumbnail is really where you get to experiment and look at how the basic color scheme is going to relate to the mood and what needs to be in the image. And I'm just going to share with you how I would actually create one of these. We're going to create some multiple variations, looking at how the different ways that we can use color theory will affect the mood. And again, I'm just going to share with you the process here. Now, as is usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is not going to be heavily edited or fast-paced. This is a real-time, fully narrated tutorial. This is me in Photoshop sharing the process step by step. It's a little bit messy. I'm often just playing with different, color blending modes and messing around and sort of, thinking and throwing stuff against the wall, seeing what works. I want to share with you the process for how I think this stuff is actually done. Think of it more like a drawing lesson. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about line and color illustration, you can check out my free quick start guide. It's aimed to get you up and running quickly in Photoshop, developing your own simple, reliable line and color process and style. You'll get access to all of the brushes and Photoshop documents and tricks and tips that I use as I create the illustration in this guide. It's free. The link will be in the description, so go check that out if that's something you're interested in. Anyway, let's jump in. So I have, there's obviously a couple of things we can look at in Photoshop in terms of color. I have a crude photograph of what is a color wheel, right? So this is a physical color wheel, and this is something that you would actually use to help you pick colors if you're kind of painting. I kind of use it essentially as a teaching aid, and I bought these off Amazon specifically to do these tutorials on color theory because it's a good way to sort of explain it. But a lot of this is in my head, so I'm going to try and reference this instead of just kind of saying, oh, well, obviously, red is a complement of green, right? Because maybe that is not obvious to everyone. But to me, these things are just ingrained in my brain, right? I see the color wheel, I kind of understand it, and I don't actually use the color wheel in Photoshop. But I've got this here in case we need it. But obviously, this is a photograph, and the colors here are not true to life, right? They're bad reproductions. So this is for educational purposes only. But we do have a color wheel here in Photoshop, and I'll reference that. But normally the way I do it is I'll show you with the hue, saturation, and slider, hue, saturation, and balance set of sliders. It just is a little bit of a simpler way of choosing colors. But anyway, let's jump into this and sort of get started. So I have here a thumbnail, right? Thumbnail / rough drawing. And this is actually not, look, it's not much of a thumbnail. I'll show you kind of how big it is. This is kind of how big it actually is. Let's drag that into Photoshop. So it's actually pretty big, but I wanted to sort of loosen up and it just kind of fit what I was doing. So it's got the same level of fidelity as a thumbnail would be, but I actually did it, quite big, right? Sort of bigger than A4, probably 11 by 14 inches, something like that. So it's just a rough, again, following the John Buscema style of thumbnails, which is, yes, you do thumbnails, you do them huge, you do them the same size as your finished art, and you just do them quickly before. It's all a matter of planning. So what I have here is a very simple plan for a drawing. And I've scanned this and I've cleaned it up. I didn't scan it, I just took a photo of it with my phone, which gives so-so results. But this is essentially what we're going to be dealing with. Now, all I'm going to do is set that to multiply. I have a black and white sort of version there. I could, add some sort of tone to that, and make these slightly sort of more orange or sepia colors. But I'll look at sort of doing that in a bit. The main thing here that we're doing is we're thinking about what color should my stuff be. And this is where often you can do this right at the end without even doing a color thumbnail, but I think it's really good to plan it in the beginning. So what I want to do is explore some different ways we could look at this same concept, and I'm going to block out. So I'll start with a color scheme initially, but then we'll look at how we can modify it and use the basic simple color plan of thinking about where is my environment and what needs to be in the scene and what color should that be. So there's a couple of different ways we could approach this. Let's say for the beginning, if we just say, I know that my character has to have like a really yellowy, orangey cape. Let's just say I know that for a start. So I'm just going to use the lasso tool, and I'm going to create a very rough, because remember this is a thumbnail, right? So I've got my sort of rough character here. And there's this weird bird thing. Lasso tool is one of the most underrated tools in Photoshop. So I think it can be really liberating to play with your color theory and really sort of get this stuff sorted. Even if maybe your drawing is not super advanced, I still think you can do little sort of thumbnail scribbles and plan the way these things might actually need to look. So yeah, maybe let's start with, okay, the character needs to be mostly yellow. Now, there's different ways that you would plan this and kind of work it up. And again, I'm going to talk about some different strategies for doing this, but let's just stay from basic color theory perspective. The character needs to be yellow. They have a yellow cape. So not all of the character is going to be yellow, but the cape is going to be yellow. So let's just think about this from a theoretical standpoint. Now, again, this is still theoretical. This is not necessarily how I would do it. I'll show you kind of how I would sort of progress through it in the beginning. So you can see that yellow here is kind of opposite our violet or purple. Now, she's in a forest. So the forest needs to be green, but obviously green is over here. So there's a couple of different options here. You could kind of say, okay, well, yellow is adjacent green, and I could basically make an analogous color scheme that is a mix of sort of greens, green blues, and blues. And I think that would work. That would be like a very effective thing to do. So that might be the most obvious thing that you would choose. There's a variety of different ways that you can play around with this idea though, but that's probably the simplest, is just to say, okay, so here I've got the slider, and basically anything next to each other on the slider is going to be fair game. So if I just kind of put a sort of desaturated, because I want this to fall into the background, if I just kind of make this a grainy, kind of yellowy, it's still warm, right? If I really sort of pull it towards the blue, then it's going to get much more blue. But I could easily create an analogous color scheme here, making probably, we'd probably want some of our foreground things to be a bit warmer and our backgrounds to be a bit cooler. So maybe that sort of cool, let's get a different brush here. So maybe that cool blue. All right, so I'm just going to go with eyedropper. There's a couple of different things you can do. I can do with eyedropper all layers, current and below. I'm just going to use current and below. This means that I'm not going to be selecting the grays that are in my multiplying layer, right? So on the eyedropper, right, hit I for eyedropper. You can point sample, current and below, right? And that is just going to mean that, right, if I click here, there we go. I can just kind of keep coloring like that. So this might be, from a theoretical perspective, if we kind of zoom out, we look at this from thumbnailing size and kind of say, well, like this could be a functional color scheme. It's going to be quite bright, and I know that the character, we could sort of give the character maybe some sort of dark olivey skin, still in that kind of warm tonal range. But yeah, you can see that this is a simple analogous color scheme, and that would kind of work fine. So yeah, you know, let's say, look, that's one way to go about it. Another would be to say, let's lean into the complement, right? And say, I'm going to go Control U. That's going to allow me to just adjusting the layers here. There we go. So Control U is going to allow me to hit hue saturation on any particular layer. So that would be similar to going up here, going Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation, right? So just Control U brings up that, and it's whatever layer I'm on or whatever is selected. So let's go similar color. The main character needs to be orange. I can't get away from it. But instead of going analogous, let's go complementary. So complementary is going to give me this sort of violet. And what that means is that I'm really over here in the purple territory. But what I can try and do is, again, kind of sort of hit a little bit more over there. And maybe we could make the background, yeah, it's kind of purpley, right? But we're just going to really pull it and make it like a gray purple. So it's a complement, but I'm going to pull it back because, again, I don't want it to be crazy and psychedelic or anything like that. But yeah, we could play around with this, and let's pull that out again. Yeah, could think about how else we might play this up. So yeah, maybe let's pull that down a bit. We could have some kind of little color scheme like this, and that might work as well. And we can see that I could potentially, if I needed to, pull in some stronger purples, stronger violets, if I needed to. But I would need to think about how that was done. But I know that this is what I essentially have to deal with, is I've got yellows, and I'm going to the complementary color scheme, and I'm just going to say, yep, they're in a forest, but the forest is a much more desaturated sort of version of a forest. And again, there's a variety of different ways we could we could sort of explore how you would pull that out. Now, this is giving me, because I'm not leaning into the idea of like, okay, I've got this yellow cape that needs to be there, and the forest is green, so I can make it green. I'm automatically in a bit of a different kind of fantasy realm in terms of color, but there's nothing inherently kind of wrong with that, right? A lot of good sort of illustration functions on that level, and I can certainly sort of say, well, this is a bit of an orangey yellow, so I can kind of maybe go a little bit towards the blue. So I could maybe have some blues in there, but I can't have any greens, let's say. So I kind of I can sort of move a little bit towards the blue, but not go crazy. And yeah, you can just play around with different sort of tonal colors here. What I've done is essentially gone to a very, very desaturated yellow. And I could sort of use this as a way to kind of maybe create some kind of highlights here. So we could kind of think about this as being the grass that's in the light. Now, it's kind of never going to look like a forest, as I said, but the color scheme will work. The color scheme will be sort of interesting, and I know I have some theory to play with. So I can probably push this a little bit more kind of blue. Right, really sort of get that into the distance, and you can see again this it has a bit of like a like an old school comic book vibe, often where the colors were kind of quite vibrant. But this is really where we need to think in the beginning, is the basics. What color scheme am I going to use? Like what tools am I going to give myself? So the main thing to understand here is that I am sort of moving away from the idea of creating a green forest. So I can't use green, but I certainly can move towards the blue, right? I could create some much more sort of saturated blues around the place, right? Maybe for some of the shadows, we got some of this sort of foliage here, right? So, some of the shadows there could be blue. And yeah, some of these kind of foreground elements could be sort of gray. Now you notice here that, again, like this is a pretty extreme abstract color scheme, but it will work pretty well. And I think one of the ideas I kind of had was that some of this stuff in the foreground here is actually up the top here is actually going to be in the foreground. Right, so we'd have some sort of trees that would actually be coming over everything here. Boom, boom, boom. And we have some bits and pieces here in the foreground. And yeah, we could probably push this blue, if we wanted. We could really push that blue in the background, make it kind of pop. I'm going to lock this, and what I'm actually going to do is select that gray that I had. I'm going to play around with what actual color is going to be there. So I don't want to go too yellow, because I've kind of moved away. I don't want to go too red. Yeah. So think about what kind of tonality we're going to have here. Now, the great thing about the line and color style is that, let's see if we can keep this to be one simple flat color. The great thing about the line and color style is that you can just select these colors that we have here. And again, I'm going to Control H is going to hide that, Control U, all right? I can play around with adjusting them very easily because everything is very simple, flat color. So again, we can play around with different tonalities. And just think about, all right, how's this actually work, right? Do we make the skin sort of darker? Is that going to work? Do we make it more sort of light? Again, I'm moving it towards the dark here. I think that kind of works. But yeah, so again, here's my other color scheme. How might we make this work? That's going off over here for some reason. All right, how's this going to work? Let's see if we can work this one up as well. That's what that one's looking like. All right, what if we did this here? So again, here, I would say an analogous color scheme is going to be, an analogous is basically just colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. A complementary one is where they're sort of opposite. And an analogous color scheme here, I think, is going to allow us to have a much easier time of things, right? So generally, if you're on the fence and you're new to color, just thinking about simple color schemes that work, an analogous color scheme where all of these colors are right next to each other on the color wheel is going to be very easy. And especially if you're not fighting some real leap of logic, like before where I had the forest that needs to be green that isn't green, right? You're always going to be fighting that. And you have to really be confident that you kind of know what you're doing and you're comfortable progressing and you sort of going down that route, because we're always going to be wanting to say, hey, let's make it green, but we can't, all right? Because we haven't let ourselves do that. So simple analogous color scheme, this will kind of work. And yeah, we might want to cool this off in the background, right? Maybe these are going to be a bit intense. Let's leave those brighter bits of green to a few little focal areas. Yeah, I feel like this is going to work, and we can really kind of punch up the brightness of some of these bits of forest here. All right, let's lock. So I've locked this. Now you can see I'm using a lot of these sort of grays, these big sort of tonal grays, but I'm hitting this with you can see it's at 60%. So this is often how I will kind of blend colors together. I've got this tonal gray here that is kind of a super desaturated green, essentially. And I'm on the character layer, and I'm just putting this at 60% over here to create what will be the kind of shadow color for this cape. And this is just giving me these good neutrals to work with. So I'm going to move back up to 100% opacity and start to paint this in. And again, this gives me a good sense of kind of shadow. Now, keep in mind there's a lot of other elements here that we haven't sort of delved into in terms of color, like that we could use to create some good color pop. So again, going to keep going on about this and sort of talk about and look at the different sort of color schemes and where we can kind of improve this. And let me know down in the comments below whether, like normally by this time I'm out of here and I've already picked some kind of color scheme and I'm moving on to the next to the next thing. So it feels a bit weird for me to be like, okay, and let's explore different color schemes. But let me know if this is interesting. Maybe I'll do one, 2-hour video that's just like, let's explore a whole bunch of different color schemes, right? So the general sort of pictorial composition, like the general idea is she's kind of standing and there's sort of trees at either side. That's sort of what we got going. Okay, boom. And in a similar way to how I was looking at these before, let's see if we can create some interesting skin tone. Now, a good way that I like to do this in general is to kind of go through and rough in, mock up where all of the skin tone tends to go. Right. I'm just going to put this in a really, really basic way. And now, again, I can control U and I put that on a separate layer. Now I can just go around as I was doing before. I really look at how we want to mess around with this color. But I think this works well from a basic color theory perspective. What I might do, let's make a new layer. Let's clip it to the one above there, and I'll just create another one there. And we'll look at maybe thinking about what color could this hair be. And again, we can control U. Think about, like, is it darker? Is it lighter? It's more saturated, less saturated. So you can kind of start one place, go to another. And this is why I kind of really like the general line and color process so much. I feel like it works quite well for actually learning color theory, because you can easily go in there and change stuff. I'm going to see if I can pick a little bit of red here, right? Maybe make that red. And I'm going to pick the hair and make a slightly sort of a darker, mushy color that we can put some of this fantasy barbarian-esque clothing. Right. And here, I think my idea was this bit back here is also like another layer. So there's many different layers here. Now this is also where, if you are creating art this way, you do have a good opportunity to play and experiment and look at how the colors that you're picking work compositionally, and you can actually quite easily go in there and mess around with the drawing by kind of saying, well, maybe it would be good to, if we sort of start to play around with the composition, this is something I would often do. I can even make it above the lines, right? Is at the end, you can start to really say, well, now that everything's basically just in there with flat colors, I can say, well, would it be better like this? Would it be better like this? This is often when I'm doing cover work, where I start to think about the big shapes. I really go in there and sort of consider those bits and pieces. But for now, again, I kind of had this weird idea that maybe there was these different kind of layers and things. Not quite sure, again, which would be better. But this aspect of your art is a major part of color theory, right? And color theory is a major aspect of the way that you sort of formalize and finalize exactly what goes where. Because often it is these little subtle things where you get into the color theory of it and you're thumbnailing things and you kind of realize, hey, you know what would be good is if there was just more of this here or more of that there, right? There was more of this big sort of swath of yellow here, and that really kind of worked. And, you can kind of play with, now that you have the color in there, right, you can play around with the graphic composition, right? And again, if I kind of add this much sort of real sort of color there, you get a good feeling for how that influences and really controls the overall sort of composition and illustrative quality, right? So again, the more yellow I have there, the more of a statement it makes, and that affects the feelings of the other colors. So planning the color is, I think, an important part of the composition, and this is where we want to try and give ourselves as many stages where we can be creative and experiment and play around. And I think this process of, sort of getting the colors in there and looking at it a little bit more as like a flat, sort of simple thumbnail. And again, often we have these little, people talk about, is this a thumbnail or whatever? The point is that what we're trying to do with the thumbnail is look at it from this size and say, is it interesting? Okay, so it doesn't matter that I did this sketch, at 14 by 11 or, huge. It's conceptually focusing on a particular level of detail. Now, traditionally, the best way to get more aspiring artists to control not working on detail is to work small. It is a lot harder to draw big and limit the amount of detail you put in. But if you can limit the amount of detail you put in and draw big, it allows you to draw quite loosely, and you can sort of draw things quite quickly. So it really is that the thumbnail process is thinking about it as a thumbnail, right? That is really the core concept there. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, let me know whether that is starting to track in the comments down below. But you can see that this is starting to come together. Now, let's group these. Maybe not that one. Actually, yeah, let's Control G that. I'll just drag this down here, and we'll just make these kind of separate groups, right? So we can kind of see, right? So we can see here I've got like very different ideas from a color perspective, and I think like they're both very valid. Now, as I said, as soon as you move away from this inherent idea of what color needs to be there in order for it to feel authentic, you're delving into the realms of illustration. And I think this is where, again, if the color theory works, you can have a purple forest and it kind of works, right? It'll have a particular feel. It'll have a particular vibe. And as long as that vibe works for you, then I think we're sort of good. Now, the trick here is that obviously with both of these, like why couldn't I just put green in here? It's like, well, you kind of got, if you sort of look at the color scheme, right? If we kind of have if we kind of got our sort of yellow at the top, and then you sort of create your purples and then your sort of greens, you're just using up too many colors. It'll become overwhelming. It'll become chaotic. And what you want to fundamentally focus on in the beginning is simple, reliable color schemes, things that just easily work. So this will work, but you have to then say, I'm painting a purple forest, and that's fine. My shadows are blue. I'm going to work warm, cool, but I'm not going to add green. You can add desaturated yellow and try and make that feel as if it is a green. And you can deal with the impressionist relativity of colors. But I can't put green in there. You can't do it. You can't do it, right? It's not allowed. It's not going to work. So yeah, we could do a similar thing here. Oh. Yeah, where we kind of work up, right, some of these other elements. Right, like let's get rid of all the copious amounts of orange we have here. See if we can focus it. Right, got some there. I'm going to turn off So in Photoshop, you can easily toggle the layer being sort of locked for opacity with the question mark key /forward/key. Quite an effective little thing to do to turn it on and off. Now, I will probably mess around with the subtlety here. But initially, what I like to do is just block in the basic patterns that I know are going to be there. So I'm thinking, what would go with this? Again, it might be good to have some really, maybe if we kind of make these earrings super blue, right? She's kind of got like crazy purpley sort of jewels and things. And the other thing we could do is play around with, yeah, let's work this bird. This bird, I haven't done this in the other one, but giving yourself a few other little opportunities to experiment and play with color is a good thing. So often this is why having more stuff in your illustration is a good thing. It will kind of allow you to say, well, look, this color scheme is not sort of coming together, but if we add a little bit of this here, it means that the whole thing will kind of feel a little bit more consistent, and hopefully that will kind of save the day. So the other things that we could do would be to, I could kind of push some of this back. I feel like that needs to be a little bit, so I'm just reducing the opacity of that, seeing if I can push back here. And what we could also do is see if pushing it back into the sort of purple for the shadows here can help us. Boom. So again, I feel like that works all right. Cool. So yeah, literally no idea which one I should choose. They're both kind of interesting. I mean, I feel like this is the most obvious, the most logical. This one looks a little bit sort of weirder. And yeah, it's just a matter of, picking. But one of the things we can do is that when we come to the finish, you could quite easily make sort of multiple versions of it because we are working in the line and color style. But I do want to sort of get going with this. So hopefully, because again, that there are other sort of elements here that we sort of need to get into in order to take this to the, to a finish. So let's look here at, like, okay, so we could actually leave this bird yellow. Like, I think that would kind of be like an interesting, maybe a few little touches here and there. Boom. So again, I'll always sort of zoom out, right? Have a look. Like that. Yeah. Again, I like sort of connecting up the character with the little familiar they have. Now we've got some stuff here in the foreground that I feel like probably want it to be a little bit sort of warmer, more like trees that it actually is. But yeah, I feel like this will work in a really interesting way. I'll probably go with this because I feel like it is what I would say is the simpler version of what you should do. Think about what is there, the character needs to be sort of have a yellow cape, and that's kind of what we need to have. Now, what would happen if the character needed to have a red cape? Well, in this case, your sort of complement of that is green, right? So red cape plus forest is an obvious sort of easy solution, right? So I could easily sort of turn this into a complement. Right, let's do a simple selective color. And what I will do is we will turn this to be, let's go to the neutrals. Right, actually, probably need to go to the yellows. Right, let's make this red. I'm going to go select color range, and we'll just kind of pick out select color range. Boom. There we go. And so you can see here, right, if we kind of zoom out, you know, that's going to work too, right? Like very sort of simple color scheme. Now, what if the, you know, what if we have something different? All right, let's duplicate this. All right, let's say it's going to be sort of tricky to fully change with color. Let's use that mask. Do color balance. All right, so we can kind of shift that around. Here we go. I could make it bright yellow. Probably need to go hue saturation because there's no real grays in there, but here we could. Yeah, let's. Here we go. So here we can easily, right, say let's make it blue. Right, would blue work? Yeah, blue would work. Now we have an even more sort of monotone forest. But we can see here that having a bit of pop of color is going to help. Again, all of these things are gonna change the feeling that we have, right? Whether or not it is gonna feel like cool, toned down, whether it's gonna feel very vibrant, whether there's a lot of contrast. And this is where you sort of have to consider, you know, how these things work. Now, obviously, we could change the color of the background to respond to this, right? We could make the color of the background yeah, let's see if we can. Don't. So we could make it sort of darker. We could play with contrast. We could sort of warm up the background versus the sort of blue cape. We could really make it sort of stand out. Again, there's a huge variety of ways you can kind of play around with the color. Now, again, there's sort of color theory, right? So if we sort of take this and just make some sort of different versions of it, so we can assess the different options we've got. Right, we could do that one. So I think it's good to always use theory as a baseline, right? And I think this is kind of what you find is that some of these things are gonna look interesting, but probably the things that are really gonna work are where you're actively contemplating. There we go. That's kind of what I'm after. It's like where we're actively contemplating what we're doing. So it's always important to understand that like sort of once you put it in there, and once you give yourself like a nice little base to work with, like you have some complements to work with, you have something logical, then it is a lot easier to, I think we need also to, put our, just one like that. See if we can get that up. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, many different sort of options for the same thing. Now, there's a couple of basic sort of rules here that are worthwhile paying attention to. And again, I apologize for kind of not sorting out a lot of those color things. A lot sort of cleaner. Often, when you are messing around with colors in Photoshop, it is a matter of like trying stuff. Try different blending modes here. Often the way that these things work when you're trying to extract color out, you're sort of adding an adjustment layer, or you're trying a different mask. Feel free to experiment. Don't imagine that the same thing is always going to work every time. There's a lot of different things that you can experiment with. The way the blending modes are going to work against different colors is going to change things. You can experiment with, as I was, having different kind of masks that you've created by, again, selecting different bits that kind of need to stay a particular color. You can push and pull that. But I think in the beginning, if you stick with something that's like very simple, right? A simple plan that will kind of always work. Here, if the cloak needs to be yellow, then we can go simple, analogous color scheme, because I know that green is sort of next to yellow, and so we're going to be able to say forest is green. If you can change what color the cape is, then you might want to do the Red Riding Hood idea and, play around with, sort of really having that green-red sort of contrast pop. You could also, say, okay, let's delve into like having an abstract background, right? The forest is purple, the forest is blue. We got this weird sort of creepy look. It's going to give us a different vibe, but we can do that because the color theory kind of works. And even though things aren't going to feel like, oh, it's just like a photo of a forest, the illustration is going to work. We know that we're going to, have a basic structure there that we can work with. And I think that's often the best thing to do. But once you've got that, you can also just kind of start messing around. And often I find, for me, this is where I get some really kind of interesting results. And if you just kind of keep messing around and playing around with it, you kind of find like, oh, that's like an interesting thing, right? And this is where, from a thumbnailing perspective, you want to just kind of sit back and be like, which one looks the coolest, right? Which one looks the most interesting? Which is the most kind of, oh, that one sort of disappeared. Like which one, I think I can get it back there. Yeah, which one is the most sort of striking? Which one is the simplest? Which one gives me the right feeling? There's obviously going to be a feeling of naturalness, of freshness, or, this one feels a little bit more sort of, weird, creepy magic. It's a little bit unsettling. This one's kind of a bit striking. We got that kind of fluoro blue. These are all going to have different feelings, and a lot of this is a matter of what the brief is, what your color sort of sense is going to be, and how you're going to sort of work that. So feel free to mess around with this. This should be a fun thing. But if you start with simple scheme that's going to work, simple plan that's going to work, it means you've always got that to fall back on. And I think if you start messing around with colors, right? You start messing around in Photoshop or Procreate or whatever program you want. Everything will kind of do this to a certain degree, where you can isolate colors, mess around with things, create some masks. Photoshop on a big workstation is going to make this a lot easier, right? I've got a million different, these are all pretty big. If I look at the size, these are all like 9,500 pixels high. So, if you're trying to, play around with a whole bunch of different experiments and you've got a million layers and you're doing it on an iPad, that may chug the iPad down. Doing this stuff where you can, look at a whole bunch of different versions is kind of nice on a big workstation with big screens. So that is one of the advantages and the reasons why I sort of tend to work that way. But yeah, if you start with a base, simple color plan always works. Analogous, complementary. I think you'll get a good insight into some different sort of takes from it. And I think from there, it becomes a lot easier to experiment and play around. And the way I experiment and play around is really through, again, just thinking about the key elements that are there, the key things that need to have color, that need to really pop, and then, comparing that to things that do or don't. And lastly, playing with simple gradients over the top, like I have with this one, I think is also a really good way to start to blend and create more homogeneous color schemes, or to get weird feelings, right? Of, things that don't necessarily make any logical sense, but make emotional color sense, right? Like, having these red gradients or blue gradients or whatever. And again, you can add them over the top to your finished image. So yeah, lots and lots of different sort of cool ideas here. I'm probably going to pick the simple one that, I kind of, think is probably the most reliable one here, which is this one, which is simple analogous color scheme. So I think that's sort of where we will begin. But yeah, let's leave these for the moment and just go back there. Okay, so these are my two stages, I guess. I've got my color rough here, and here's my sort of initial little sketch. Now, what we need to do now is figure out how this kind of turns into the drawing phase, and we need to think about a couple of things that are related to the finished product and kind of how this will play into color. And this is another part of, what I want to dig into. So it's important to think about what is the fidelity of the finished image you want to create. Because certainly we could just render all this grass in excruciating detail, but that's probably going to be pretty boring, right? Because grass is not that interesting to look at. So what we might think about doing is increasing the fidelity of this forest. And as we do that, it's worthwhile looking at whether or not we want to introduce some of these characters into that forest, right? So there's a couple of ways we could do that, and we can experiment again at this stage very, very simply. So you could play with some simple ideas here where you kind of say, well, wouldn't it be cool if we had a few little bits of this kind of red here, right? I've kind of done that a bit here and there, right? That might sort of look interesting. The other thing you could do, Control U, is we could think about, well, what other colors might they be, right? Maybe it would be better to have them to be blue, because that's going to blend in with the background more and going to allow us to kind of pull focus here. So you could think about, right, blue flowers. You could maybe think about blue flowers that have a little bit of red in them, right? And then we could also think about how, maybe it might be worth creating some that are bigger, right, in the foreground to really sort of pop. Bump, bump. And, we could also think about, okay, what about if we create some to overlap here. Yeah. And then if we kind of play around with that and, sort of experiment, you can see now from a color perspective, I'm starting to get a little bit more simplification. And I can also play with the idea here of thinking about, look, how much detail do we put into the foliage here? Right, and is this going to look good? Is this going to feel like it's kind of too much, too little? All right, what's going on here? And this gives you a feeling for the level of complexity and the way that you can change the different color theory elements of that complexity. And I can do that very simply, right? By just kind of creating little blobs, basically. Right? And I think doing plenty of this, right? Just experimenting with these same ideas can be a really good, simple way of just playing with these concepts, right? And this is where you kind of like if you put stuff in and it's sort of not right, it's not feeling like there's enough depth. Again, this is where you can think about like, oh, do I need another layer here, right? Do I need an extra, right? Do I need something more? Maybe I need to actually put in a few branches or things that are kind of going up here, right? And showing that this is kind of in the foreground. So you can see that these are things that are going to be increasing the visual fidelity of the image, as opposed to maybe if it was just a really small illustration, right? Maybe we don't need that stuff there. But you will get a real sense for that at this stage, and you can think about it in terms of the overall sort of color theory. Right? Like how can we, like, do I need to do this with value, or is there some kind of other way that we can do this? And you could also start to experiment with, like maybe we could play around with adding, right, some different bits and pieces here. Right? Maybe if there was some different, maybe I could try and put, right, like a few other little bits and pieces. Now, obviously that might be a bit on the nose. It's exactly the same blue there. But yeah, we could play around with this, right? We could play around with different bits and pieces there. Yeah, sort of experiment. Yeah, and again, that's going to give us a good feeling of complexity. So if we kind of look at the difference there, it's just kind of planning these things, and I'm doing it with simple color. Now, the next stage that we need to play around with is obviously, right? So I'm kind of balancing some of this blue over here. We could make these red. We could make them also kind of yellow. But yeah, it's totally up to you / me, how we go about that. So again, that's kind of the idea of incorporating, playing around with color and thinking about this as a sort of flat color as part of your process. This gives me a good way to experiment and explore and make these decisions where they matter, right? As I was saying, if I want to, make this cape a lot bigger, it's very hard when I'm doing it at the drawing phase to really kind of get a feel for like how that's going to affect things. Because you don't really see the effect of the graphic nature of the color. If I do it now, it's a lot easier to see how this is going to work. And in a similar way, often we have ideas of like strong color versus complexity and pattern, right? So often if you have a big group of sort of detail, like I've got all these leaves and things here, if I have a lot of stuff here, often, again, not having a lot of color vibrancy up here, you know, not having like, you know, green or blue flowers or something like that in the leaves. I mean, that might be an interesting thing to do as well if you wanted that extra kind of color vibrancy. I think that's like kind of probably a cool idea. And I'm like, oh, maybe I will do that. You know, again, like that means that we're going to have like enough stuff. We don't ever want to just kind of have like slabs of grass, slabs of leaves, and things like that if you're really trying to get a higher level of visual fidelity. If you're trying to get a higher level of sort of detail, you know, you want this to be printed really big, you need to think about, with a line and color style at any rate, how we're going to sort of fill that detail and sort of add stuff. Otherwise, from my experience, it's very easy to end up with kind of too much, just kind of boring stuff. And again, at a thumbnail stage, that'll work, but when we zoom it up and add detail, that will become problematic. So anyway, this probably gives us a good idea of, you know, how you could experiment with this simple concept. Now, this gives us a good place to kind of launch from. And this really is the thumbnail. This is often what I would send to a client or someone I'm working with and say like, hey, this is the general idea, right? They know the brief, they know the idea. This kind of gives us a concept for how the feeling of the color is going to affect everything, what the composition is going to look like. And, you know, if I kind of change it, right, you know, if I kind of was to add that kind of sepia tone across everything, then, you know, it's going to affect everything in a very different way, right? It's going to drastically change the mood. If I change this color, right, again, you know, this is going to really sort of affect the way it kind of feels. But, you know, if you get a pretty strong composition and, you know, make everything work, then look, you're going to be able to mess around with an experiment. Anyway, what do we do next? How do we transition from this to a kind of finished drawing? And I think also now that we've got these bits of blob here, how do we kind of figure out what they are from a drawing perspective and start to plan the process? Let's look at that next. All right, that's all I've got for part 1 of this tutorial. Hopefully these ideas of how to develop simple color plans and think about how the scene and the objects within the scene, the characters relate to the colors you choose. Let me know in the comments down below whether this was helpful, whether this gives you some ideas. What we've got up next in part 2 deals with the construction phase. And this is where we take all of the blobby drawings that we kind of did here, and we kind of look at how we are going to turn that into a finished, polished illustration. And there's a lot of interesting color things here that we'll also kind of start to unpack, because it's interesting to see how the construction drawing kind of, you know, still has to consider some of those color choices we made in the beginning. So I'll put that up soon. When it's up, you'll be able to check it out here. Other than that, I'll see you down below in the comments. Happy drawing.